My name is Odalys. I'm 34 years old, and 3 months ago, my parents rang my doorbell for the first time in 9 years. They weren't there to apologize. My mother stepped past me into my kitchen, opened my refrigerator like she still lived there, and said, "Your sister's restaurant is drowning. You're going to co-sign the loan to save it." My father stood in the doorway, arms crossed, nodding at every word like a man agreeing with himself. So I said, "Or you could let it fail the way you let my catering business fail 9 years ago and let her figure it out herself." My mother called me spiteful. My father called me a coward hiding behind spreadsheets. My sister texted me that same night to say I was the reason the family was falling apart. But here's what none of them knew. 11 days later, a records clerk at the Secretary of State's office would hand me a single printed page, and that page would prove my sister's restaurant had never actually been drowning at all. It had been quietly, deliberately bled dry, one wire transfer at a time, for 3 straight years. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories. This is the channel where quiet people finally tell the family stories they kept to themselves for years, and where boundaries get the last word. If you've ever been told you owe your family everything, this one is for you. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and subscribe, because you're going to want to see how this ends. Let me back up to the beginning, because you need to understand exactly what happened to me 9 years ago before you'll understand why I asked for that document instead of my checkbook. I have to take you back to the year I turned 25, the year I opened a small catering company out of a rented commercial kitchen downtown, built on 18 months of careful saving from a job I'd hated and a business plan I'd rewritten 11 times until the numbers finally worked. My parents, Regina and Baptiste, had always treated my younger sister Odette as the family's designated success story. She was the one they sent to culinary school, the one they helped with a down payment on her first apartment, the one whose every small accomplishment got announced at church like a papal decree. I was, by contrast, the one who was always so serious about money. A phrase my mother delivered less as a compliment and more as a mild character flaw, the way you describe someone as being allergic to fun. My catering business grew slowly but genuinely for its first year. A few weddings, a corporate lunch contract, word of mouth building the way it's supposed to. Then, 6 weeks before what would have been my biggest contract yet, a 120-person gala for a regional bank, my walk-in refrigerator failed catastrophically overnight, destroying nearly $11,000 in prepped inventory. And without insurance coverage, I hadn't yet been able to afford, threatening to sink the entire company before it ever had the chance to prove itself. I asked my parents for a short-term loan, $8,000, repayable within 90 days once the gala contract paid out. I had a signed contract in hand. I had a repayment schedule written out. What I got instead, delivered at their kitchen table with a specific, practiced gentleness I recognize now as rehearsal, was a no. "We already helped Odette with her apartment this year," my mother said. "We can't stretch ourselves for 2 businesses at once. Yours is riskier anyway, honey. Maybe this is a sign to try something more stable." I lost the gala contract. I lost the business 4 months later, folding under debt I'd taken on personally to try to salvage it, debt that took me nearly 5 years to fully pay off working 2 jobs. Odette, that same year, received a $15,000 investment from our parents to help launch her own restaurant, an amount I only learned the full size of years later, delivered with none of the hesitation, none of the risk assessment lecture, none of the 90-day repayment schedule I'd been required to produce for a fraction of that sum. I rebuilt slowly, the way I imagine some of you watching this have had to rebuild. I retrained as a financial analyst, a field considerably less glamorous than catering, but one where, I discovered, I had a genuine, specific talent. The same careful, methodical attention to detail that had once gone into costing out a wedding menu now went into reading a company's books for exactly the kind of quiet inconsistency most people never think to look for. I built a career over the following 9 years at a regional investment firm, working my way up to senior analyst, and I built, alongside it, a life entirely separate from the family that had decided, at the exact moment I needed them most, that my dream was the riskier one. I stopped attending most family gatherings around year 3 of that rebuilding. Not through any single dramatic rupture, but through a gradual, deliberate distancing that felt, at the time, like simple self-preservation. My mother would occasionally text a photo from a family dinner I hadn't been invited to with enough advance notice to actually plan around, always captioned with some version of "missed you tonight," language that managed to sound like affection while requiring nothing at all from the person sending it. Odette's restaurant, over those 9 years, became a genuine local fixture, a warm, well-reviewed bistro that expanded once, then again, that regularly appeared in the city's best of lists, that my parents talked about with the specific, glowing pride I remembered them never once directing at my own catering business, even in its brief, promising early months. I want to be honest that I did not spend those 9 years nursing some active, burning resentment about this. I had built my own life, my own career, my own quiet stability, and I had made a specific, deliberate peace with the fact that my family's admiration simply flowed toward whichever child required less effort to admire. If you've ever built an entire second life specifically so you'd never again need to ask your family for anything, you already know exactly the kind of stillness I carried through most of that decade. Stay with me, because what happened when my mother finally, after 9 years, rang my doorbell again is only the beginning of what I eventually found. Hit subscribe so you don't lose this before I tell you about the doorbell. The knock came on a Saturday morning in early spring, and I want to describe it precisely because the mechanics of that morning matter. 2 knocks, then the bell, the exact same pattern I remembered from childhood, my mother's specific, impatient rhythm. I opened the door and there they were, 9 years compressed into a single doorstep, my mother in her church coat holding nothing this time, no peace offering, no plate of anything. My father a step behind her, with his jaw already set. My mother walked past me into my kitchen without being invited, the same casual, entitled ease I remembered from childhood, opened my refrigerator briefly out of what I can only describe as pure habit, and then turned to deliver what I understood, within about 4 seconds, was the actual reason for this visit. "Odette's restaurant is in serious trouble," she said. "The bank is calling the loan due, and if she can't refinance within 30 days, she's going to lose everything she's built. You have a good job now, a good credit score. You need to co-sign the refinancing with her." I asked, evenly, what exactly had happened to put a thriving, expanding restaurant into a position where the bank was calling a loan due. My mother waved the question away with the same specific gesture I remembered from 9 years earlier when I'd asked, at that same kitchen table, why my own business's risk had somehow mattered more than my sister's. "It doesn't matter how it happened," she said. "What matters is that she's your sister, and this family doesn't let each other fail." I want to describe exactly what settled over me in that moment, because I think it matters for understanding everything that followed. It was not simple, hot anger. It was something colder and more specific, the particular clarity of hearing a sentence you recognize instantly as being applied selectively, deployed now for the sibling it had never once been deployed for 9 years earlier. "Or," I said, "you could let it fail the way you let my catering business fail 9 years ago, and let her figure it out herself." My mother's face did the thing I remembered, the specific transformation from warmth to wounded outrage that had always, throughout my childhood, functioned as a kind of emotional weapon. She called me spiteful, said she couldn't believe I'd bring up something from a decade ago at a moment like this. My father, finally speaking, called me a coward hiding behind spreadsheets, unwilling to take a real risk for family the way I apparently took no risks at all in my safe little analyst job. I opened the door and let them out, and that evening, my phone buzzed with a text from Odette herself, the first direct message I'd received from her in over a year. "You're the reason this family is falling apart. Del, I hope you can live with that." I did not respond that night. I want to explain why, because I think the reasoning matters. 9 years of financial analysis training had built into me a specific, disciplined instinct. Before reacting to a claim, verify it. And something about my mother's specific, practiced vagueness, "It doesn't matter how it happened," had lodged itself in my chest in exactly the way a client's evasive answer to a direct question always has, professionally, throughout my entire career. I began, the following Monday, doing what I have always done under exactly this kind of pressure. I started gathering information, quietly, methodically, before I let a single emotion drive a single response. I want to walk through what I found over the following 11 days, because I think the specific, patient texture of it matters as much as any single dramatic discovery. I began with something entirely within my professional wheelhouse and entirely public. Odette's restaurant operated as an LLC, and LLC filings, ownership records, and any recorded liens against a business are a matter of public record, searchable through the state's Secretary of State office and county recorder. Exactly the kind of due diligence I ran routinely, professionally, for my actual job evaluating companies for potential investment. What I found, over those 11 days, unfolded with a specificity that made my stomach turn in a way 9 years of professional distance from my family had not fully prepared me for. Odette's restaurant, Café Beaumont, had indeed taken out the original $15,000 loan from our parents 9 years earlier, formalized, I was surprised to learn, as an actual documented loan rather than the informal investment I'd always understood it to be, secured against a small ownership stake in the business itself. Over the following years, as the restaurant genuinely, legitimately grew and expanded, that original loan had been refinanced twice, each time at a larger amount, ostensibly to fund the restaurant's expansions. First, a $50,000 refinance for the second location build-out. Then, 4 years ago, an $80,000 refinance that public records described, in the terse language of a commercial mortgage filing, as funding, working capital, and equipment upgrades. I want to describe the specific detail that shifted this from an unpleasant family favoritism story into something considerably darker. Cross-referencing the restaurant's business filings against county property records, I found that roughly 14 months after that $80,000 refinance, my father, listed separately, had purchased a lake property 2 counties over, cash, no mortgage recorded, for just under $72,000. I sat with that number for a long time. $72,000 purchased in cash 14 months after an $80,000 loan had been taken out against my sister's restaurant for equipment upgrades. I want to be honest that I did not, in that moment, allow myself to leap immediately to the worst possible conclusion. Coincidences happen. Cash purchases happen. I understood, professionally, that a single suspicious timeline is not proof of anything, and I was determined not to let 9 years of accumulated resentment toward my parents shape my reading of numbers before I had the complete picture. I want to describe what I did next, because I think the specific, methodical texture of it matters. I retained an attorney, a sharp, precise woman named Marisol Aconquires, who specialized in commercial fraud and family business disputes, recommended by a colleague at my firm who'd navigated a similar situation with her own family's real estate holdings. Marisol reviewed the public filings I'd assembled and gave me an assessment that reframed the scope of what I was actually looking at. This pattern, on its own, isn't conclusive, she told me, but it's exactly the kind of pattern that warrants a formal records request. If your sister's restaurant took out loans specifically documented as funding business expansion, and that money instead flowed, even partially, into your father's personal assets, that's not simply a family favoritism issue anymore. Depending on how the restaurant's LLC is structured and who actually controls its finances, that could constitute misappropriation of business funds, potentially fraud against the lending bank itself if the loan applications misrepresented how the money would actually be used. I want to be honest about the specific, complicated grief I felt hearing that assessment, because I don't want to present this as a purely clarifying, purely satisfying moment. I loved my sister. 9 years of distance had not erased that, however much it had also not repaired it, and I understood, sitting in Marisol's office, that whatever I found next was very likely going to implicate not just my parents, but potentially Odette's own restaurant, her own livelihood, the thing she had actually built with genuine hard work over the preceding decade. Marisol formally requested the restaurant's full loan documentation and disbursement records through the appropriate channels, a process that, combined with additional property and business filing searches, took the full 11 days I'd mentioned. I want to describe the moment those records finally arrived, because I think it represents the actual turning point of this entire story. The loan disbursement records for that $80,000 refinance showed, in the specific, undeniable language of a bank's own wire transfer logs, that only $31,000 of that loan had actually been used for anything resembling the stated purpose. A walk-in cooler replacement, a point-of-sale system upgrade, both legitimate, both documented with actual vendor invoices. The remaining $49,000 had been transferred, in 3 separate disbursements over the following 8 months, into an account belonging not to Café Beaumont, but to a joint account held by my parents directly. I want to describe the specific document that made everything click into place, the single printed page the county recorder's clerk handed across the counter to me on that 11th day, the moment I referenced at the start of this story. It was a UCC financing statement, a public filing documenting a security interest. Essentially, a formal record showing that my parents, using the restaurant's own equipment and a portion of its future revenue as collateral, had positioned themselves, quietly, formally, as the restaurant's largest creditor, ahead of the actual bank loan itself. A filing Odette, according to what I would later confirm, had signed without independent legal review, at a kitchen table, trusting. The way I once had, that her parents had her actual interests at heart. I want to sit with what that filing actually meant, because I think it's the crucial piece. My parents had not simply helped fund Odette's restaurant 9 years earlier, and then, coincidentally, benefited from its success. They had, over the following years, restructured the restaurant's own debt in a way that extracted cash for their own personal use while simultaneously, formally, legally positioning themselves to be repaid first, ahead of the actual commercial lender, if the restaurant ever failed. And now, with the bank calling its own loan due, a call that, I would learn, had been triggered by exactly the kind of cash flow strain that siphoning $49,000 out of working capital would predictably cause. My parents' solution had not been to use their own considerable, quietly accumulated resources, including a lake house purchased in cash, to help their daughter. It had been to ask me, the daughter they'd once refused $8,000 to at the exact moment I most needed it, to formally co-sign and personally guarantee the very debt structure they themselves had engineered and profited from. If you've ever discovered that a family's request for your help was actually a request to absorb the consequences of their own quiet theft, you already know exactly the kind of stillness that settled over me holding that single printed page. Stay with me, because what happened when I finally sat Odette down with everything I'd found is not the conversation either of us expected. Subscribe now so you don't lose this before I tell you what she said. I did not go to my parents first with what I'd found. I want to explain why, because I think the reasoning matters enormously. I understood that confronting them directly would simply produce more of the same practice deflection I'd already encountered at my kitchen table. It doesn't matter how it happened, without ever forcing a full, honest reckoning with what the restaurant's own money had actually been used for. I was determined, this time, to go to the one person who actually deserved to see the complete picture before anyone else did, Odette herself. I called her, and I want to be honest that the conversation began badly, colored by the accusation she'd texted me weeks earlier. I asked her, plainly, whether I could come by, that I had something important to show her about the restaurant's finances, information I thought she deserved to see before anyone signed anything else. She agreed, reluctantly, clearly still operating under the assumption that I was arriving either to lecture her or to finally, grudgingly agree to co-sign. I sat across from her at a table in her own restaurant, after closing, and I laid out the documents in the order Marisol, and I had assembled them. The original loan, the 2 refinances, the disbursement records showing the $49,000 diverted, the timeline of my father's cash lake house purchase, and finally, the UCC filing positioning our parents as the restaurant's primary secured creditor. I want to describe watching my sister's face as she read through that folder, because I think it represents the actual emotional core of this entire story more than any single legal detail within it. She read slowly, at first, and then faster, flipping back and forth between documents with a growing, visible horror that told me. Immediately, she had genuinely, completely not understood any of this until that exact moment. They told me the refinance was all for the equipment and the new kitchen line, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I signed what they told me to sign. I trusted them. Dell, I actually trusted them. I want to sit with that sentence, because I think it echoes something I've come to understand across this entire ordeal about how our parents had built their relationship with each of us differently, but toward the exact same end. With me, 9 years earlier, they had denied help entirely, framing my business as too risky to invest in. With Odette, they had provided help generously, visibly, publicly, and then, quietly, methodically, extracted considerably more from her success than they had ever actually put into it, positioning themselves, through paperwork she'd never independently reviewed, to profit regardless of whether the restaurant ultimately thrived or failed. I'm not here to tell you I told you so, I told her. I'm here because you're about to sign your name to a refinance that would make you personally, financially responsible for a debt structure they engineered for their own benefit. And I wasn't going to let you do that without knowing the truth first. I want to be honest that, Odette, and I did not, in that single conversation, fully repair 9 years of distance. That would be a considerably tidier story than the one I actually lived. But something real, something I hadn't expected, began that night. A genuine, shared understanding, built not on old resentments, but on a mutual, freshly documented grievance against the two people who had, in entirely different ways, treated both of our livelihoods as resources to be managed for their own benefit. Over the following weeks, Marisol, now representing both of us jointly given our aligned interests, formally demanded a full accounting from our parents regarding the diverted funds and the UCC filing, alongside a formal notice that Odette intended to challenge the security interest as improperly obtained, given that she had signed it without independent legal counsel and without full disclosure of how the underlying funds would actually be used. I want to describe my parents' response to this formal demand because I think it matters for understanding how this ultimately resolved. My father, initially, attempted the same aggressive posture he displayed at my kitchen door, threats about lawyers, about disowning both of us, about the specific ingratitude of daughters who'd forgotten everything their parents had sacrificed. That posture lasted, notably, for exactly as long as it took Marisol's formal letter to reach their own attorney, a man who, upon reviewing the wire transfer records and the UCC filing himself, apparently delivered a considerably more sobering assessment than my father had expected, because within 2 weeks, the aggressive threats stopped entirely. The resolution, once it came, arrived through a formal settlement rather than a courtroom, a choice both Odette and I made deliberately, understanding we had a strong legal position but preferring, where genuinely possible, to resolve this without years of protracted litigation eating whatever value remained in the restaurant itself. My parents agreed to release the UCC filing entirely, restoring the bank's normal senior position on the loan, and to repay the diverted $49,000 to the restaurant's operating account over a structured 3-year period, funded, notably, in part through the eventual sale of the lake property, a resolution my father accepted with what I'm told was considerable visible bitterness, but accepted nonetheless. Once his own attorney made clear exactly how poorly a full accounting would likely go for him if this proceeded to court. I want to close this out by telling you where things actually stand now, roughly 7 months after that doorbell rang, because I think you've earned the honest, complete accounting rather than a tidy bow. The restaurant survived, refinanced properly this time, through Odette's own independent negotiation with the bank, without my co-signature and without any further involvement from our parents in its financial structure at all. She has since brought in an independent accountant, someone with no family relationship to any of us, to review every future financial decision the business makes. A boundary, she told me, plainly, she wished she'd insisted on 9 years earlier, before trust and convenience had quietly, gradually let one set of parents' access go entirely unchecked. My relationship with Odette, I want to be honest, remains a work in progress. But it is, for the first time in nearly a decade, an actual relationship rather than a distant, wary silence. She calls now, sometimes just to talk, and she told me recently, over a dinner at her own restaurant that she insisted on paying for, that she finally understood, fully, what our parents' refusal to help me 9 years ago had actually cost. Not just my business, but 9 years of a sister she might have had anyone in that family ever once been honest with either of us. My parents and I do not speak, as of this recording. My father's number remains blocked. My mother sent one letter, shortly after the settlement finalized, and I want to be honest that I read it, unlike some versions of this story you might have heard, because I wanted, genuinely, to know whether it contained anything resembling an actual accounting of what they'd done. It did not. It contained, instead, a lengthy explanation of how difficult things had been for them financially, how the lake house represented decades of sacrifice finally paying off. Language that told me, plainly, exactly how much had not changed, and exactly why I did not respond. Here's what I learned, standing at that county recorder's counter holding a single printed page that finally, undeniably explained everything. Families can build, over years, an entire quiet architecture around which child's success gets protected, and which child's risk gets treated as a cautionary tale. And that architecture can hold seamlessly, right up until someone finally requests the actual paperwork behind it. A UCC filing, like a wire transfer record, like a cash property purchase timed just a little too precisely, does not particularly care how confidently that architecture was built. It only needs one careful daughter, with 9 years of professional training in reading exactly what numbers actually say, to finally put it all in the right order. If you've ever been asked to bail out a family member's crisis, without ever being told the actual truth about how that crisis was created, this story was for you. Do one thing for me this week. Before you ever co-sign, guarantee, or hand over money to help a family member in crisis, ask to see the actual records first, gently but directly, because you deserve to know exactly what you'd be signing your name to. Comment "Paper remembers" if you made it to the end with me, and share this with someone who might need to start asking for the paperwork in their own family too. Hit subscribe so you never miss a story, and I'll see you in the next one.